Well, we've just galloped through 1,000 years of European Christian art and architecture in just 6 days. Now I'm going to commit an even greater educational crime and jet through 3,500 years of Chinese art in 2 days. 3, if you count our day on Chinese Buddhist art back in an earlier unit. I hope you will forgive me. I am not sure I can forgive myself. Remember this from way back in August? What is it? The Jade Kong was our very first Chinese work. This is a Neolithic work without a written history, and there's a very lively debate among art historians about what the Kong and the face on it actually meant in Neolithic times. Judging from the sample questions, the College Board seems to have come down on the side of the argument that the square shape of the Kong represents the earth, just as round bidiscs represent the sky, and that the face has some kind of shamanistic associations based on similarities to later Chinese works that might or might not carry the same meaning. You can tell I'm not entirely happy about this, but consider yourselves warned. We do know that Kongs were found in large numbers in graves of persons of high rank, which suggests some connection to ritual. Some also show signs of having been intentionally burned, maybe even intentionally broken, and that also suggests a use in sacrifice. Back in August, I threatened that we would return to these images later this semester when we looked at other examples of Chinese art. Well, that moment has arrived. None of these works shows up on the required list, but the method for making them does show up on the College Board's list of essential knowledge. Go figure. These early bronze works also serve as an important introduction to aspects of Chinese religion, politics, and culture that will continue to influence Chinese art for the next 3 millennia. We've talked about bronze before. It's primarily an alloy of copper, tin, and lead, and it produces durable and lustrous works of art. So what are these works and how are they made? Left to right, we see the Hellenistic boxer, the early medieval Hildesheim church doors, and the 16th century Benin wall plank. All are made from bronze using the lost wax method. Chinese bronzes, by contrast, were traditionally cast by the ancient Chinese in ceramic piece molds. In piece mold casting, the artist makes a model, then takes a clay mold. The mold is cut into sections to release the model, and then the sections are reassembled after firing to form a mold for casting. If the object is a vessel, then a core has to be placed inside the mold to provide the vessel's cavity. Very complicated process, very innovative. So most of these works were excavated from tombs. And what kind of a society produced these bronzes? It was a highly stratified society with kings and nobles on top, peasants on the bottom, and an army of skilled craftsmen who produced these goods for the king. But why bury such incredibly beautiful and expensive works of art in tombs? I should just note that that wasn't all that was buried. Shang tombs contained lots of extra bodies, which were probably servants sacrificed, maybe enemies, to serve the dead in the afterlife. The Bronze Age Chinese believed that the king's right to rule was based on his good relations with the spirits of his ancestors, who controlled the destiny of the domain. It was also the king's duty to please the great forces of nature, the sun and rain gods. The distinction between nature and gods is not necessarily a clear one in Chinese and other cultures. And those gods, those nature gods, nature forces, controlled the outcome of the harvest. To make sure that these gods and the spirits of his own ancestors would look favorably on his kingdom, the king made regular sacrifices of wine and cereals, which were placed in these elaborate bronze vessels and heated over fires on a temple altar. Does this remind you of any of the cultures we've studied so far? Certainly the Egyptians also believed that the pharaoh's spiritual standing helped secure the kingdom. Well, we rather optimistically included the Guang as a McConnell-Jacobs required work. It was an elaborate wine cup found in tombs and used for libation offerings, that is, liquid offerings to the gods. Again, at the heart of the Shang-era Chinese religion was the belief that ancestors must be constantly offered food and drink so that they would intercede with the gods on their descendants' behalf. One of the characteristic designs on Chinese bronzes is the Tao Tu figure, which I've circled here. This drawing of the Tao Ti image next to the Aztec great Coatlicue should give you an idea of why art historians sometimes compare Shang Dynasty bronzes to Mesoamerican art. There are even art historians or archaeologists who think that there was a connection between the two cultures, that there was actually communication across the Pacific sometime in the distant past. This hasn't been proved. Most archaeologists are skeptical. Still, the similarities are remarkable, and maybe at some point DNA testing will settle the question. By the way, I really like this. The Tao Ti is sometimes translated as gluttonous ogre. Note the similarity between the gluttonous ogre on the Guang and the face on the Kong. Do you also remember the term for animal-like shapes? It's zoomorphic. The Shang dynasty is the first historic Chinese dynasty. That is, it's the first one for which we have written records. I'm not including any art from the successor Zhou dynasty. Basically, they continued the bronze tradition, particularly making bronze bells. But I do want to note that this is the dynasty that seems to have introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, which I hope you heard about in your homework video. Basically, to justify overthrowing the Shang rulers, the Zhou claimed, probably rightly, that they had become corrupt and self-indulgent and therefore had lost the favor or the mandate of heaven. The Zhou dynasty gradually dissolved into several competing kingdoms who, as the name Warring States period suggests, spent a lot of time fighting wars with each other. This relatively short period is actually extremely important to art history and to intellectual history, not so much because of the art it produced, but because this turmoil helped give rise to three very important philosophical schools that are still represented in Chinese art, I would argue, up to this day. Since we have a huge amount of ground to cover, I'm going to assume that you did your homework and learned something about these two philosophies, and I'm going to move fast. Confucius was a minor government official who was deeply disturbed by the chaos that was overwhelming China. He developed a philosophy that focused on creating and preserving social order, mostly through right relationships. These relationships, in his view, were hierarchical, necessarily hierarchical, and the most important of these was the relationship between father and son. The ruler became, in effect, father to the entire country. This also fit in with the notion of heavenly mandate in the rulers who failed to maintain strong, and I should note mutually reciprocal beneficial relationships, deserve the failure that heaven rained down on them. All subjects, like all sons, owed obedience and veneration to their fathers and to the emperor. But, in turn, fathers and emperors were expected to rule their sons and their subjects justly, or else there might be consequences. Another Chinese religious tradition that developed during this period, religious or philosophical, there's some dispute about which it is, but at any rate, that developed during this period was Taoism. It, too, focused on harmony, but in this case it was a harmony created by an equilibrium of opposites, yin and yang, shown by these familiar symbols. The principle of yin-yang sees the world as filled with opposing but also complementary forces, action and non-action, light and dark, hot and cold, and of course, most famously, male and female. Taoism also focuses on unity with nature and a way, that's actually what Tao means, that put a person into harmony with his or her own environment. This philosophy, like Confucianism, integrated easily into the notion of the mandate of heaven, with a twist. According to Taoist thought, nature itself could rebel against an unjust ruler, responding with hurricanes, floods, etc. to unjust rule. To talk about the third philosophy, I'm going to turn to China's first emperor and, finally, our first College Board required work of art for this unit. China was reunited in 221 BCE under King Cheng, who later renamed himself Shi Huangdi, which simply means first emperor. He initially ruled the Qin kingdom on the western edge of the old Zhou kingdom. Emperor Qin and his associates followed a harsh philosophy or school of law that was known as legalism, and it grew also out of the turmoil of the Warring States period. It was basically an extreme form of absolutism. It called for unquestioned devotion to the king. Eventually, this stern governing philosophy and a very powerful, well-led army broke the power of the regional feuding factions, and we have a unified Qin empire. Legalism was known for its consistent but very harsh punishments. Basically, legalists thought Confucians were a bunch of softies and Taoists were a bunch of tree huggers. Off with their heads. After that is, they'd slowly cut off all the other body parts first. Qin famously ordered most existing books to be burned, and he buried more than 400 Confucian scholars alive, just in case they had more ideas. But to give Qin credit, he was also an extraordinarily effective leader. He unified China, he expanded its borders significantly, he built the first version of the Great Wall of China, he established a uniform set of Chinese characters, which is why even though people in China can't necessarily understand each other with their different dialects, they can all read Chinese. He also established a uniform currency and a system of weights and measures. He created an efficient central and also regional bureaucracies. And, of course, he built a powerful army manned by soldiers from all over China. Remember, the Chinese believed that ancestors became spirits who could wreak good or evil on their descendants, depending on how diligently their descendants kept feeding the ancestors food and drink, or otherwise propitiating these spirits, and, as the idea developed, depending on whether their successors behaved in a way that would earn the approval of the gods. Well, Chinese historians report that Qin was also obsessed with his own immortality. He took all sorts of steps, traveled into strange places to try to find chemicals or drinks or whatever that could make him immortal. But apparently, and for good reason, he was not especially confident that future generations would take good care of him. He set out to solve this problem the way he solved all his other problems, with a powerful army loyal to the emperor. The discovery of Emperor Qin's Terracotta army is one of the really amazing stories in the history of archaeology, right up there with King Tut's tomb, and you're about to see archaeologists haven't yet opened his main tomb. Let's watch another segment from the Engineering and Empire series that I like so much. As always, the entire video will be up on Moodle. Well, not only can the age and mood of the soldiers be seen from their facial expressions, but their faces also represent soldiers from different parts of China. The head, arms, and legs and torsos were created separately and then assembled. The terracotta figures are life-size. They vary in height, uniform, and hairstyle in accordance with their rank. Most originally held weapons such as spears, swords, or crossbows. In fact, these weapons have become a hugely important source of information for military historians. The figures were also originally painted with bright pigments. Although only sections of the three pits have been excavated, about 300,000 weapons of various kinds have been uncovered to date. Most of these weapons are bronze, and they were ready to be used in battle. When excavated, some of them were still sharp enough to cut a hair. The swords were coated with chromium to prevent rust, and that's a technology that the West wouldn't figure out for more than 1,000 years. Qin Shi Huangdi decreed a mass production approach for creating his army. The artisans who may have been previously makers of drainage pipe, which was also a terracotta product, they turned out figures almost like cars on an assembly line. Clay, unlike bronze, lends itself to quick and cheap manufacture. Workers built the bodies, then they customized them with heads, hats, shoes, mustaches, ears, and so on, made in small molds. Some of these figures appear so strikingly individual that they seem to have been modeled on real people. Art historians think that's probably not the case. The British Museum had an exhibit of these soldiers, and the curator commented that he thinks they may have been aggregate portraits. The ceramicists could have been told that they needed to represent all the different types of people who came from different regions of China, and essentially different expressions were kind of proxies for some ethnic diversity. By the way, recent digs have revealed that in addition to clay soldiers, Emperor Qin's underground realm included terracotta bureaucrats and even troops of acrobats, slightly smaller than the soldiers but created with the same methods. You see one here on the left. He also had lots of company in his tomb. Any concubine who hadn't borne him a son had the dubious privilege of being strangled and buried with the emperor, and the workmen who built the tomb were also closed in as soon as it was completed and left to die. Altogether, Emperor Qin was, as you can see, a charming fellow. By the way, you can also see from the photo that the soldiers had sustained fairly significant damage even before they were excavated in the 20th century. The working guess is that this happened at the hands of the general who led the rebellion against the Qin dynasty and installed the Han dynasty that followed. The brutal but effective Qin dynasty was, again, succeeded by the Han dynasty, which ruled China for a period roughly commensurate to that of the Roman Empire. Historians actually love to compare these two empires. They had a lot in common. This was one of China's golden ages. It was a time of economic prosperity, scientific advance, and at least at first, political unity and pretty good government. It was also an age of great art. Han works fill art museums all over the world. I've included a few examples here, none of which is a required work. Instead, we're going to examine just one Han dynasty work, but it's an artifact that really captures the world of the Han remarkably well. But before I get to Lady Di's funeral banner, let me talk a little bit about what historians call the Han synthesis. Basically, Han rulers combined the three philosophies I've already discussed: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. The Han rulers revered books and learning. To be a bureaucrat in that and later administrations, you had to pass tough exams. There was no more burning books and burying scholars. But the Han rulers did adopt the Qin belief in an absolute central government and spent most of their period in power trying to regain the same level of centrality that the Qin and the legalists had accomplished so ruthlessly. Taoism contributed to the Han belief that the universe is run by a single principle, the Tao, or great ultimate. And this principle is divided into two opposite principles, yin and yang again. Yang is the force of creation, yin is the force of completion and degeneration. Notice, by the way, there are some real similarities with Shiva and Vishnu. At any rate, yang is male, yin is female. From Confucianism, Han thinkers and emperors adopted the notion of hierarchy, with the emperor very much the guy on top. But the responsibilities were mutual, and especially the emperor was responsible for creating economic conditions that promoted prosperity and for ruling by example as a strict but benevolent father. By the way, this is sometimes called, the Han synthesis is also sometimes referred to as Neo-Confucianism. At any rate, an emperor who followed these principles and maintained a balance between them would, the theory went, earn the mandate of heaven and enjoy a long and prosperous reign. We just looked at one of China's big archaeological finds from the last century. The tombs at Baowangdui and Hunan province were another. The three coffins you see on the right held a Chinese nobleman, his wife, that's Lady Di, and probably their son. The Lady Di was buried with a large collection of luxury goods intended to sustain her in the afterlife. By the way, her body was so well preserved that doctors were able to perform an autopsy. Apparently, she died of a heart attack, probably brought on by a diet too rich in sugar and fat. Be forewarned. The painted silk banner was painted, by the way, with ink on silk, was draped over her coffin. Earlier, it had probably been carried in front of her funeral procession to present her name in the afterlife. Some art historians, however, think it may have been intended as a kind of spell fabric designed to bring her back to life. Lady Frankenstein, not Lady Di. We do know that immortality was serious business in China, as we just saw. A more likely theory is that the banner was intended to attract the spirit of the deceased to stay in its tomb, where it could be properly started on its afterlife journey instead of remaining on Earth to bother the living. Troublesome ancestors were also serious business in China. The banner describes Lady Di's journey to heaven. It's decorated with grave goods, spirits, legends, and symbols of immortality that are associated with the Queen Mother of the West. I'm not going to try to pronounce her Chinese name because I'm going to get it wrong. The banner's design is divided vertically into yin, that's left, and yang, right, Horizontally, and that's really the top part that's divided that way. Horizontally, it's divided into the three realms of heaven, earth, and the underworld. So let's start with the upper or heavenly realm. On the left side, that's the yin or female side, we see a toad above and a rabbit next to a crescent moon. According to legend, a woman named Chang Yi was selfish enough to gulp down all of an elixir of immortality that her husband had won from the Queen of the West, taking it all for herself, leaving none for him. Not a very appropriate hierarchical action. Although she did gain immortality, she began to float up toward the moon and was transformed into a toad. So she gets to be immortal as a toad. Next to the moon, we see the rabbit who's pounding herbs into the mortar to make the elixir of immortality. On the right side, which is the yang or masculine side, we see a sun with a raven. According to legend, 10 suns lived in a tree. Each morning, one of the suns took a turn shining in the sky, and the others got to rest in the tree. One day, they got bored with their orderly life. They all rushed up into the sky at once and ran around wildly having fun and scorching the earth. The legendary archer Hu Yi became so angry at the sight of the dead and dying, burned people on earth that he shot 9 of the 10 suns. He had to be reminded to leave one sun in the sky. The moral of the story, by the way, is that suns should know their place in the universe and obey the hierarchy, right? The central figure in the upper middle is probably Nuwa, a goddess who had the body of a snake and could change shape 70 times a day. She apparently modeled the first people from mud. There are lots of stories about that, and taught them how to have children. On either side of her are cranes, which are symbols of longevity. Below them are heavenly dragons. The dragons shown here are the dragons that draw the moon and sun across the sky. Anyway, experts argue about all of these interpretations, and I certainly don't know enough to take sides. But more generally, let me ask this. What do these images suggest about Chinese beliefs? Well, it seems pretty clear that the design reflects at least some belief in an ordered heavenly realm and in spirits, a natural division between female and male roles, and a strong preference for everyone following the rules in order to maintain order. It also, by the way, shows the importance of family and the importance of sacrifices. The central part of the banner shows Lady Di in her earthly roles. Here we see her leaning on a cane while 2 persons crouch or kneel in front of her, and 3 women, presumably female servants, stand behind her. And here, lower down, we see her family offering sacrifices and prayers for the safe ascent of Lady Di's soul to heaven. Notice that the ritual vessels for offering food and drink to the ancestors look a lot like the bronzes we saw at the beginning of this lecture. Khan Academy didn't include an image from the underworld for some reason. I always like underworld or hell images. So here we see a powerful male figure supporting the lower platform, bracing his feet against the back of 2 intertwined fish, who apparently are getting it on. More yin and yang. In fact, this figure may be a water deity who generates yin and yang and therefore ensures that the seasons progress, that crops grow, and that more babies are made. Does this remind you of imagery we saw back in our unit on Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic art? Remember these images, where they came from, what they're called? Back to the banner, note that the 2 dragons run along the edges of the lower section, and they help unify the space. Their bodies pass through the hole of a bi-disc, which again traditionally represents the sky or heavenly realms, just as the square cone or square shape represent the earth. Now, we've seen quite a few dragons, and you've probably seen or at least seen pictures of dragons parading around on Chinese New Year. So what do dragons signify in the Chinese tradition? Anybody know? Well, first of all, in Chinese tradition, unlike, say, the Christian traditions such as St. George and the dragons are good guys, sort of. They bring masculine energy or yang to the universe. They bring rain, but they also bring floods and earthquakes. In other words, they represent power and energy. And the Han emperors, eager to win and keep power, adopted the dragon as their symbol. So here we have belief in an afterlife, We have a depiction of family piety and order. We have a contrast between yin and yang, a shout out to the emperor because the Han immortalized. We see the Han synthesis immortalized on a piece of silk. The Han Dynasty also saw a major expansion in China's interaction with people outside their borders. The famous Silk Road opened under Han rule. It skirted, indeed, it was sheltered by the Great Wall. It connected China to Constantinople and Rome, and the Silk Road also encouraged travel. Chinese society, as a result, became more cosmopolitan, more open to outside influences. But heavy tax burdens, those centralized bureaucracies do not come cheap, nor do the armies, a concentration of land in the hands of a few wealthy aristocrats, and disunity at court, lots of fights apparently between empresses, emperors, and eunuchs. At any rate, all of these brought down the Han Dynasty. For the next 300 years, China was once again ruled by warring states, and some of them were controlled by Turkic people who came in from the steppes. The Silk Road did not just bring Roman glass and Afghan lapis lazuli to China. Eventually, in 618 CE, the Tang Dynasty succeeded in reuniting China and would rule until 908. By the way, you do not need to know all of these Chinese dates. I actually think keeping the dynasty straight and having a general sense of when it was is going to be good enough. So we've already talked about the Sui and Tang dynasties. What big development from this period shows up in our course? Although I should say we have, and you may not remember that we've already talked about these dynasties. These were the years when Buddhism came to China. A Mahayana Buddhism, you may recall, hope you recall, that emphasized communal salvation, a hierarchical order that included multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and communion with nature, all themes that resonated with the Chinese and fit in many ways into the Han synthesis. The Sui and Tang leaders also used Buddhism to bolster political power and the legitimacy of their regime. Remember China's one empress, Wu Zetian? She was the great patroness of this complex, which was the Longmen Caves. I'm going to stop here and finish up my whirlwind tour of Chinese art in my next lecture. Be forewarned, questions about Buddhist and Hindu art from the earlier unit will appear on the unit test. You have a chance to review the earlier unit test, or you will have a chance to review the earlier unit test, and that'll make a few fewer topics you need to worry about for your semester final. You may be out of time, but if you're not, here's a chance to do some interesting comparing and contrasting. Wish I could be there for it.